In the spaces between recorded history, where silence holds court over crumbling stone and shifting sand, there dwell the echoes of peoples whose names were never carved into the monuments of kings. They move through time like shadows cast by fires that burned long before memory began to keep its careful count. Their voices rise from broken pottery shards and weathered foundations, speaking in languages that dissolved into the wind centuries before scribes learned to capture sound with symbols. Here, in the gentle darkness before sleep claims you, we gather these whispers, fragments of lives lived in the margins of empire, dreams dreamed beneath stars that have since forgotten their names. Let the mystery of their existence settle over you like dust over ancient ruins, soft and inevitable, carrying you toward the quiet lands where the unknown dwell eternal. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one beneath the desert sands of what we now call the empty quarter, where the wind writes and rewrites its endless stories across dunes that have never known the footfall of modern explorers. There once stood cities whose inhabitants possessed no names that survive in any language we might recognize. They built not in stone, but in sun-dried brick, their walls rising like gentle dreams from the earth itself. And when the climate shifted and the rains stopped coming, their structures returned to the dust from which they had been born, leaving only the faintest impressions in the sand shadows of shadows, memories of memories. The archaeological records speak of them only in whispers and speculation, carbon dating places their existence somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, during the great flourishing of Bronze Age civilizations. Yet they left behind no written records, no great monuments, no treasures that would catch the light of modern museum displays. What they left instead were patterns, geometric designs carved into rock faces that emerge briefly after rare sandstorms, only to be buried again by the next wind. Circular foundations that appear in satellite imagery like crop circles made of stone. And most mysteriously, a series of deep wells that descend far beyond any reasonable need for water, as if they were reaching toward something other than the water table. Dr. Sarah Chen, the archaeologist who first catalogued these sites in the 1990s, described the feeling of standing among their ruins as listening to a conversation in a room after everyone has left. The pottery fragments she uncovered bore no resemblance to any known ceramic traditions of the region. The clay itself seemed to have been mixed with materials that shouldn't have existed in that environment. Traces of seashells in a desert that had been dry for millennia. Volcanic ash from mountains that had never existed in that latitude. And, strangest of all, microscopic particles of what appeared to be meteoric dust, as if the very stars had been ground into their clay. The settlement patterns suggested a people who understood water in ways that modern desert dwellers might envy. Their communities were always positioned at points where underground water sources converged, yet they seemed to have access to these sources through methods that left no visible aqueducts or irrigation channels. Instead, they had developed a system of underground passages that connected their wells to distant water sources through natural cave systems that honeycombed the bedrock of the Arabian Peninsula. These passages were carved with the same geometric patterns that appeared on their pottery and rock faces, spirals within spirals, interlinked circles that seemed to dance even when carved in motionless stone. But perhaps most intriguing were the burial sites. Unlike their neighbors who interred their dead in elaborate tombs filled with grave goods, these unknown people practiced a form of burial that seemed designed to erase all trace of individual identity. Bodies were wrapped in shrouds woven from plant fibers that dissolved completely within decades, leaving behind only the geometric jewelry they wore in bands of copper and silver, arranged in patterns that matched those found on their pottery and walls. The jewelry itself was crafted with techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered until the medieval period, involving the precise heating and cooling of metals in ways that created alloys of unusual strength and beauty. The graves were arranged not in rows or family plots, but in spirals that corresponded to astronomical alignments, not with the obvious markers like the solstices or equinoxes, but with the rising of star clusters that would have been visible in their night sky but have since shifted due to the precession of the Earth's axis. It was as if they were burying their dead according to a calendar written in stars that no longer shine in the same positions, following a celestial map that has been redrawn by time itself. In the laboratory, analysis of the metal alloys revealed another mystery. The copper contained trace elements that suggested it had been mined from sources that modern geologists haven't been able to identify. The isotope signatures didn't match any known copper deposits in the Arabian Peninsula, nor in any of the surrounding regions where ancient trade routes might have carried the raw materials. It was as if they had access to mineral sources that existed outside the known world of their time, or perhaps they had developed methods of transforming common copper into something approaching the purity of modern refined metals. The silver told an even stranger story. Chemical analysis revealed that it had been alloyed with platinum, a metal that wasn't supposed to be known to any human civilization until the Spanish encountered it in South America in the 16th century. Yet here it was, worked into delicate bands and spirals by people who had lived and died thousands of years before Europeans had ever heard of the New World. The platinum content was precisely controlled, suggesting not accidental contamination, but deliberate craftsmanship by metallurgists who understood properties of metals that wouldn't be documented by Western science for millennia. Their tool-making revealed similar anomalies. Among the artifacts recovered from the settlement sites were cutting implements that appeared to be made from obsidian. Yet obsidian sources existed nowhere within 1,000 miles of their homeland. Closer inspection revealed that these weren't made from volcanic glass at all, but from a material that resembled obsidian, yet had been artificially created through some process that modern materials science couldn't readily explain. The tools held edges sharper than surgical steel and showed no signs of wear, even after what must have been decades or centuries of use. The question of their disappearance haunted Dr. Chen throughout her career. There were no signs of warfare, no evidence of natural disaster, no indication that they had migrated to other regions. Their settlements showed signs of gradual abandonment over a period of perhaps 50 years, as if the population had simply dwindled away through some slow process that left no archaeological trace. The last occupied buildings were those closest to the deep wells, suggesting that whatever had caused their decline, they had gathered closer and closer to their water sources before finally vanishing entirely. The wells themselves presented the deepest mystery. Modern drilling equipment had been able to descend only part way down the ancient shafts, before encountering chambers that had been deliberately sealed with stones fitted so precisely that no mortar had been needed. Ground-penetrating radar suggested that these chambers extended horizontally for considerable distances, forming an underground network beneath the desert that might have connected settlements separated by hundreds of miles of surface territory. But the sealed chambers remained sealed. Dr. Chen's funding had run out before the expensive and difficult work of opening them could be undertaken. In her final report, submitted to the Journal of Archaeological Science just months before her retirement, she wrote, "We are dealing with a people who seem to have existed in the margins of possibility itself. Every technical achievement we attribute to them pushes against the boundaries of what we believe was possible for their time. Period. Yet the evidence is undeniable. They knew things they shouldn't have known, possessed materials they shouldn't have been able to obtain, and accomplished engineering feats that we struggle to replicate even with modern technology. And then, having mastered all of these impossibilities, they simply faded away, leaving behind only questions carved in stone and metal. The geometric patterns they carved into rock faces have been the subject of extensive study by mathematicians and astronomers. Professor Michael Harrison of Cambridge University spent 3 years analyzing the mathematical relationships encoded in the spirals and interconnected circles. His conclusions, published in a paper that bridged archaeology and pure mathematics, suggested that these ancient people had discovered mathematical constants that weren't formally recognized by Western mathematics until the development of fractal geometry in the 20th century. The patterns seemed to encode information about the behavior of complex systems, the way water flows through porous rock, the manner in which roots spread through soil, the patterns formed by lightning as it branches through the atmosphere. It was as if they had developed a visual language for describing natural phenomena that modern science expresses through differential equations and computer modeling. The implications were staggering. A Bronze Age people who had somehow intuited mathematical relationships that took modern civilization millennia to discover through formal scientific methods. But the patterns encoded more than just mathematical relationships. Dr. Elena Vasquez, an ethnomusicologist who had studied the acoustic properties of ancient structures, discovered that the geometric designs could be translated into musical scales. When she programmed a computer to convert the proportional relationships in the carvings into musical intervals, the result was a harmonic system unlike anything found in other ancient musical traditions. The scales seemed to be based on mathematical relationships that produced what modern acoustic theory would call perfect resonance, combinations of frequencies that create the most psychologically soothing effects on human listeners, played through speakers positioned in recreation of the original carving sites. The music had an almost hypnotic quality. Listeners reported feeling deeply relaxed, and several volunteers in Dr. Vasquez's experiments fell asleep within minutes of hearing the ancient harmonies. Sleep studies conducted with the music showed that it induced unusually deep states of rest, with brainwave patterns that suggested the deepest levels of non-REM sleep. It was as if these unknown people had discovered through geometry and mathematics what modern sleep science was only beginning to understand about the neurological mechanisms of rest and restoration. The discovery led to speculation that the geometric patterns had served a practical purpose beyond artistic expression. Perhaps they had been integral to the daily life of the settlements, creating acoustic environments that promoted the deep rest necessary for survival in the harsh desert climate. The deep wells, with their precisely carved chambers, might have functioned as acoustic resonators, amplifying and modulating the natural sounds of wind and water to create the harmonic frequencies encoded in the surface carvings. This theory gained support when acoustic modeling of the underground chambers revealed that they would have functioned as sophisticated acoustic instruments. The sealed chambers appeared to be precisely tuned to create standing wave patterns that would have made the entire underground network into a vast musical instrument, played by the natural forces of wind and flowing water. Anyone living above Ground would have been surrounded by a constant, barely audible harmonic environment that would have influenced their sleep patterns, their emotional states, and perhaps even their cognitive abilities. The implications extended beyond mere comfort. Recent research in neuroscience has shown that specific acoustic frequencies can influence brain chemistry, promoting the production of neurotransmitters associated with learning, memory consolidation, and creative problem-solving. If the unknown people had deliberately engineered their living environment to optimize these neurological processes, it might explain their apparent technological achievements. They might have created a society-wide enhancement to human cognitive capability through nothing more than careful attention to mathematics, acoustics, and architecture. But as fascinating as these discoveries were, they only deepened the central mystery. How had a Bronze Age people, working with primitive tools and no written language, achieved insights that modern science was only beginning to approach? And perhaps, more haunting still, what had caused them to abandon technologies and knowledge that might have benefited all of human civilization? Dr. Chen often said that studying their remains was like finding a single page torn from the middle of a book written in an unknown language. Every answer revealed to new questions. Every discovery highlighted the vastness of what remained unknown. The unknown people had lived in the spaces between the great civilizations of their time, apparently content to remain invisible to history, developing their remarkable understanding of mathematics, metallurgy, acoustics, and engineering in complete isolation from the recorded world. Their story was written in materials that would outlast the stone monuments of pharaohs and the clay tablets of kings, yet it was a story that could only be read in fragments, its meaning forever tantalizingly beyond complete comprehension. They had achieved a form of immortality that the great rulers of antiquity never attained of. They lived on not as names carved in marble, but as questions that would endure as long as humans continued to seek understanding of their own past. In the misty highlands of what is now southern Chile, where ancient forests climb toward peaks that have never been named in any modern language, there once lived a people who built their cities in the canopy of thousand-year-old trees. The Spanish conquistadores who first penetrated these valleys in the 16th century reported seeing cities in the air before altitude sickness and the hostility of the terrain forced them to retreat. Their accounts, dismissed for centuries as hallucinations brought on by oxygen deprivation and fear, began to make sense only when satellite imaging in the 1980s revealed geometric patterns in the forest canopy that could not be explained by natural growth. The patterns were subtle, barely visible, even in high-resolution photographs, but they suggested an organized use of the forest environment that went far beyond anything known from other pre-Columbian civilizations. Certain species of trees had been encouraged to grow in precise geometric arrangements, their branches trained and grafted to create natural platforms at specific heights above the forest floor. Other species had been systematically removed or redirected, creating corridors of open space that followed mathematical curves through the dense woodland. Dr. James Thornfield, a botanist from the University of Edinburgh, led the first scientific expedition into the region in 1987. What his team discovered revolutionized understanding of pre-Columbian forestry and suggested that the indigenous people of the area had developed a sophisticated form of arboriculture that amounted to three-dimensional city planning. The trees themselves had been modified through techniques that combined selective breeding, careful pruning, and what appeared to be primitive forms of genetic manipulation achieved through crossbreeding and grafting. The canopy platforms were not simple tree houses or temporary shelters, but permanent architectural structures created through the careful manipulation of living wood. Branches had been trained to grow in specific directions and then fuse together to create floors, walls, and even roofing systems that were completely integrated with the living trees. The platforms were connected by bridges made from interwoven branches that had been encouraged to grow toward each other from adjacent trees until they met and fused, creating pathways through the air that were as sturdy as conventional bridges but completely alive. The engineering principles involved were extraordinary. Each platform was positioned to take advantage of the natural sway patterns of its host tree, with flexible joints that allowed the structures to move with the wind rather than resist it. The weight distribution was calculated so precisely that the trees not only supported the platforms but seemed to thrive under the additional load, growing larger and stronger than unmodified trees of the same species. It was as if the forest people had understood principles of bioengineering that modern science was only beginning to explore. But the most remarkable discovery was the evidence of what Dr. Thornfield termed assisted evolution. The forest people had apparently developed techniques for accelerating the natural growth processes of trees, causing them to achieve in decades what would normally require centuries. Trees that should have taken 500 years to reach the massive sizes necessary to support canopy platforms showed growth rings indicating they had achieved this growth in 50 to 80 years. The accelerated growth showed no signs of the weakness or structural problems that would normally result from such rapid development. Chemical analysis of the wood. Samples revealed that the trees had been systematically treated with organic compounds that enhanced their cellular growth while simultaneously strengthening their fiber structure. The compounds appeared to be extracted from other forest plants through processes that modern phytochemistry would classify as advanced biochemical engineering. The forest people had essentially created natural performance-enhancing drugs for trees, allowing them to build with living materials that possessed strength and flexibility, characteristics superior to traditional construction materials. The platform cities extended throughout the forest in a network that covered hundreds of square miles. Ground-based surveys revealed that the forest floor beneath the canopy cities had been modified as well, with underground root systems that had been trained and grafted to create natural plumbing and irrigation networks. Water was collected from the frequent mountain rains by the tree canopies and channeled through hollow roots to underground reservoirs, then distributed throughout the tree cities through a pressurized system that operated entirely through natural hydraulic principles. Food production was integrated into the architectural system. The forest people had developed forms of vertical agriculture that used the modified trees as frameworks for growing crops at different levels of the forest canopy. Each level was optimized for different types of plants, taking advantage of the varying light conditions and microclimate zones created by the carefully managed tree coverage. They had essentially created three-dimensional farms that produced more food per acre than conventional ground-based agriculture while leaving the forest. Ecosystem not only intact but enhanced. The social organization implied by the canopy cities was as sophisticated as their engineering. Different platform levels appeared to serve different social and economic functions, with the highest platforms reserved for activities that required the most skill and training. The distribution of platforms throughout the forest suggested a decentralized social structure that avoided the concentrated population centers that characterized most ancient civilizations. Instead of building cities that dominated their environment, the forest people had created communities that were fully integrated with the natural ecosystem. Archaeological evidence from the platform sites revealed a people who had achieved remarkable sustainability. There were no signs of environmental degradation, no evidence of resource depletion, no indication that their activities had damaged the forest ecosystem. Instead, the forest appeared to have flourished under their management, with biodiversity levels higher than those found in unmanaged forest areas. They had somehow achieved the goal that modern environmentalists could only dream of: a human civilization that enhanced rather than degraded its natural environment. Their tool technology was as integrated with their forest environment as their architecture. Rather than working metals or stone, they had developed techniques for hardening and shaping wood that produced tools with performance characteristics equal to metal implements. They had learned to extract and concentrate the natural resins, lignins, and cellulose compounds that give wood its strength, creating composite materials that were lighter than metal but equally durable. Their cutting tools held edges that remained sharp for decades. Their building tools were perfectly balanced for the specific tasks they were designed to perform. But perhaps most remarkably, they had developed what could only be called biotechnology. They had learned to breed and modify insects and small animals to serve technological functions within their civilization. Certain species of ants had been trained to maintain the living architecture, pruning excess growth and applying organic treatments to prevent disease. Modified beetles served as living sensors, changing color or behavior to indicate changes in weather, soil chemistry, or the health status of the trees. Birds had been bred for enhanced intelligence and trained to serve as communication networks, carrying coded messages between distant platform cities. The forest people had also developed a sophisticated understanding of plant biochemistry. They had identified and learned to synthesize compounds that could influence the growth and behavior of both plants and animals. Some of these compounds appeared to function as natural antibiotics, preventing disease in their modified trees and domesticated animals. Others served as growth regulators, allowing them to control the timing and direction of plant development with precision that matched modern agricultural techniques. Most intriguingly, they had developed what appeared to be natural, psychoactive compounds that enhanced human cognitive abilities. Chemical analysis of residues found in certain ceremonial platforms revealed the presence of complex organic molecules that would have acted as nootropic substances that enhance memory, learning, and creative problem-solving abilities. The compounds were apparently derived from rare forest plants through extraction and concentration processes that required sophisticated knowledge of organic chemistry. The ceremonial platforms themselves suggested that the forest people had developed a spiritual or philosophical system as advanced as their technology. These platforms were positioned at specific locations that took advantage of acoustic properties of the forest environment, creating natural amphitheaters where sound would be amplified and modulated by the surrounding trees. The acoustic effects were precisely tuned to enhance certain frequencies of human speech and music, creating conditions that would have promoted group psychological states associated with learning, creativity, and social bonding. The disappearance of the forest people remained as mysterious as their achievements. There was no evidence of warfare, disease, or natural disaster. Instead, the platform cities showed signs of gradual abandonment over a period of approximately 2 centuries, beginning sometime in the 14th century and concluding just before the arrival of European explorers. The latest occupied platforms were those closest to natural water sources, suggesting that climate change might have played a role in their decline. But the region's climate records showed no significant changes during the relevant time period. More puzzling still, the abandoned platforms showed evidence of deliberate restoration work. Before leaving each site, the forest people had carefully removed all non-organic materials and had treated the living architecture with compounds that accelerated its return to natural forest conditions. It was as if they had deliberately erased the evidence of their civilization, guiding their modified trees back toward natural growth patterns and removing all traces of their technological achievements. Dr. Thornfield spent the final years of his career trying to understand this deliberate. In his posthumously published memoirs, he wrote, "They achieved something that no human civilization before or since has accomplished: perfect harmony with their environment, sustainable technology that enhanced rather than degraded the natural world, and social organization that avoided the conflicts and inequalities that have plagued every other complex society in human history. And having achieved this perfection, they chose to walk away from it, to return their achievements to the forest and disappear into history as if they had never existed. The living remnants of their civilization continued to function for decades. After their departure, the modified trees maintained their enhanced growth patterns and structural modifications. The trained animals and insects continued their assigned functions, maintaining the empty platforms and preserving the biological systems that had supported the forest cities. But without human guidance, the systems gradually devolved back toward natural patterns, and within a century of the forest people's departure, only the most subtle traces of their achievements remained visible to scientific analysis. Modern attempts to recreate their biotechnology have met with limited success. While contemporary science can understand the principles behind their achievements, the practical knowledge required to implement their techniques has been lost. Their methods appear to have required not just scientific understanding, but also intuitive knowledge of forest ecosystems that could only be developed through generations of careful observation and experimentation. They had achieved a form of scientific knowledge that was inseparable from deep cultural connection to their environment. The forest people represented a path not taken by human civilization, demonstration that advanced technology and environmental harmony were not mutually exclusive, that human ingenuity could enhance rather than replace natural systems. Their story, preserved in the growth rings of ancient trees and the chemical signatures of modified forest soils, suggested possibilities for human development that remained largely unexplored by modern industrial civilization. They had lived so lightly upon the earth that their civilization was virtually invisible even to careful scientific investigation. Yet they had achieved technological and social accomplishments that surpassed in many ways the achievements of civilizations that left behind massive monuments and written records. They had solved the fundamental problem that continues to challenge modern society: how to create human prosperity without environmental destruction. Then, having solved it, they had walked away, leaving only whispers in the wind-stirred branches of trees that remembered their touch in the deepening twilight of the forest, where mist begins to gather among trees that still carry the genetic modifications introduced by hands that worked centuries ago. Their legacy endures not as monuments to human achievement, but as quiet demonstrations of possibilities that remain, even now, barely glimpsed by a world that has chosen different paths through the landscape of human potential. The wind that swept across the Sahara in those forgotten centuries carried more than sand. It carried the whispered prayers of people whose names have been erased from stone, whose gods have been forgotten by time itself. These were the Garamontes, builders of an impossible civilization in the heart of what we now call emptiness. engineers of water in a land that seemingly offered none in the deep Sahara, where modern satellites now reveal the ghostly outlines of ancient cities. There once flourished a people who understood secrets that died with them. The Garamantian settlements stretched across what is now southern Libya, their capital Garamamada, Jerma sitting like a jewel in the desert, sustained by an engineering marvel that would make modern hydrologists weep with wonder. They carved tunnels through bedrock, following underground rivers with an intuition that seemed to border on the mystical. These fogeras, as archaeologists now call them, stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the desert floor, bringing life-giving water to cities that should never have existed. The tunnels were dug by hand, each one a testament to a collective vision that spanned generations. Each shaft a prayer carved in stone. The Garamantes understood water as a sacred trust. Their settlements weren't built around the discovery of water, they were built around the promise of water, around the faith that if they dug deep enough, followed the subtle signs that only they could read, they would find the hidden rivers that flowed beneath the desert's burning skin. And somehow, impossibly, they always did. In the ruins of their settlements, archaeologists have found evidence of a society that defied every assumption about life in the Sahara. These were not nomads scratching out a bare survival. They were urbanites, traders, craftspeople. They built multi-story houses from salt blocks and stone, created elaborate irrigation systems that fed their gardens, developed a writing script that remains largely undeciphered to this day. The Garamantian script appears on pottery shards and tomb walls, flowing symbols that seem to dance across the clay and stone like water itself. Some scholars believe it may be related to ancient Berber scripts. Others see influences from the Egyptian hieroglyphs that traveled the trade routes. But the symbols maintain their mystery, carrying messages from a people who left no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual key to unlock their thoughts. What we know of them comes filtered through the accounts of their enemies and trading partners. The Romans called them fierce warriors who rode into battle in horse-drawn chariots, their bodies painted with ochre and their hair braided with gold. Tacitus described them as a people who knew no law but that of the sword. But this was the judgment of an empire that feared what it could not control. The truth, gleaned from the archaeological evidence scattered across their former territories, paints a more complex picture. The Garamantes were builders and dreamers, a people who looked at the harsh Sahara and saw not an obstacle but an opportunity. They developed techniques for salt mining that supported trade networks stretching from the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa. They domesticated animals that others considered impossible to tame, creating herds of cattle that somehow thrived in conditions that would kill modern livestock. But perhaps their greatest achievement was something that can barely be reconstructed. From the fragmentary evidence they left behind, their role as intermediaries in a trade network that connected worlds. The Garamantes sat at the crossroads of desire, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and dreams between civilizations that had never heard of each other. From the north came Roman glassware, Mediterranean wine, North African textiles. From the south came gold dust from mines whose locations are still debated, ivory from elephants that once roamed green savannas, exotic feathers from birds that existed only in the deepest forests. But the Garamantes were more than passive middlemen. They added their own contributions to this river of commerce. They were master salt miners, harvesting the crystalline deposits that formed in the ancient lake beds scattered across their territory. But this wasn't ordinary salt, it was salt imbued with the minerals of a landscape that had been shaped by millions of years of geological transformation. Romans prized Garamantian salt not just for its purity, but for its supposed medicinal properties. Its ability to preserve not just meat, but youth itself. The Garamantian salt roads were more than trade routes, they were arteries of cultural exchange. Paths along which languages mingled and mythologies cross-pollinated. A Roman merchant traveling south along these routes might encounter Garamantian guides who spoke fragments of a dozen languages, who could navigate by stars that had different names in every settlement, who carried water in gourds that had been blessed by gods whose names the merchant would never learn to pronounce. These guides knew the desert's moods as intimately as a lover knows the rhythm of breath in sleep. They could read the color of the sand to predict where water might be found, could taste the wind to determine whether a sandstorm was building beyond the horizon. They carried knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries, passed down through oral traditions that required no writing because they lived in the body, in the instincts, in the subtle awareness that meant the difference between life and death in the Sahara. The Garamantes developed a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, not for its own sake, but as a navigation tool essential for survival. They built circular stone structures, some archaeologists call them proto-observatories, where they tracked the movement of stars and planets. These observations weren't abstract scientific pursuits, but practical tools for scheduling the long journeys across trackless desert, for determining when the seasonal rains might fill the distant waterholes. Their astronomical knowledge was encoded in oral traditions that have largely been lost, though fragments survive in the folklore of modern Tuareg and Tibu peoples who still inhabit the region. These fragments speak of star patterns that served as celestial maps, of constellation myths that contained encoded information about water sources and safe passages. The night sky for the Garamantes wasn't a distant spectacle, but an intimate guide, a book written in light that told them everything they needed to know about their place in the world. As the Roman Empire expanded southward, seeking to control the trade routes that brought African gold northward, the Garamantes found themselves caught between their traditional autonomy and the demands of imperial taxation. Roman accounts describe a series of campaigns against Garamantian settlements, expeditions led by generals who vastly underestimated the challenges of desert warfare against an enemy that could literally disappear into the landscape. The Roman General Cornelius Balbus claimed to have conquered the Garamantian capital in 19 BCE, but the archaeological evidence suggests that this conquest was more like a negotiated settlement that allowed the Romans to claim victory while permitting the Garamantes to maintain their essential autonomy. The desert was too vast, too unforgiving for traditional Roman military tactics. The Garamantes didn't need to defeat Roman armies, they simply needed to outlast Roman patience. What ultimately brought about the decline of Garamantian civilization wasn't military conquest, but environmental catastrophe. Around the 3rd century CE, the climate of the Sahara underwent another of its periodic shifts toward aridity. The underground water sources that had sustained Garamantian cities for nearly a millennium began to fail. The Foggara system, despite its engineering brilliance, couldn't pump water fast enough to replace what was being lost to the increasingly arid climate. The end came not with the drama of conquest, but with the quiet desperation of a people watching their world literally dry up beneath their feet. One by one, the outlying settlements were abandoned as their water sources failed. The population gradually concentrated in fewer and fewer centers, each struggling to support numbers that had once been spread across the territory. The last references to the Garamantes in historical sources date to around the 6th century CE. but by then they were already shadows of their former selves. The great trade networks had shifted eastward, following more reliable water sources. The salt mines, without sufficient water for processing, became economically unviable. The astronomical observatories fell into disuse as the communities that had maintained them dispersed into smaller, more mobile groups. Today, satellite images reveal the ghostly outlines of hundreds of Garamantian settlements scattered across the Libyan Sahara circular stone foundations, the geometric patterns of ancient field systems, the straight lines of Foggara channels cutting across landscapes that are now completely barren. These images are haunting in their clarity, offering a bird's-eye view of a civilization that its own inhabitants never could have seen. Modern archaeological expeditions to former Garamantian sites face challenges that would have been familiar to the ancient inhabitants: extreme heat, limited water, navigation across featureless terrain. But they also face challenges unique to our time: political instability, restricted access, and the heartbreaking knowledge that many sites are being systematically looted, their artifacts sold to private collectors who care nothing for the historical context they destroy. The artifacts that do make it to legitimate archaeological study tell stories that are both intimate and cosmic. Garamantian pottery shows influences from across Africa and the Mediterranean, but it also displays distinctive local innovations techniques for creating vessels that could store water for months without contamination. Decorative patterns that seem to encode astronomical information. Glazes made from local minerals that created colors found nowhere else in the ancient world. Their metalwork reveals sophisticated techniques for working with limited fuel sources. In a landscape where wood was precious and coal unknown, the Garamantes developed methods for achieving the high temperatures necessary for iron smelting, using carefully controlled fires fueled by grasses and animal dung. The iron tools they produced were not just functional but beautiful, decorated with patterns that suggest each tool was seen as a collaboration between the craftsperson and the metal itself. Perhaps most mysteriously, Garamantian burial sites contain evidence of religious practices that seem to blend influences from across the ancient world while maintaining a distinctly local character. Bodies were buried with their heads pointing toward specific star patterns, accompanied by grave goods that included Roman glassware, sub-Saharan ivory, local pottery, and small metal objects whose purpose remains unclear. Some graves contain what appear to be astronomical instruments, metal discs with carefully placed holes that may have been used for star observations. Stone tablets inscribed with symbols that may represent constellation maps. These objects suggest that the Garamantes viewed death not as an ending, but as a transition to a different kind of existence, one that required navigation skills just as sophisticated as those needed for desert travel. The religious beliefs of the Garamantes are largely lost to us, filtered through the biased accounts of Roman historians who had their own reasons for misrepresenting African spiritual practices. But hints survive in the archaeological record: ceremonial sites built around natural rock formations, evidence of ritual sacrifices that seem to have been related to water ceremonies, deposits of precious objects in locations that appear to have been considered sacred. One recurring theme in Garamantian religious sites is the presence of carefully arranged collections of stones brought from distant locations. These stone collections, some containing specimens from hundreds of miles away, suggest a worldview in which the landscape itself was seen as sacred, in which different locations possessed unique spiritual properties that could be concentrated and combined through ritual practice. The effort required to collect and transport these stones across desert distances speaks to religious commitments that were both profound and practical. In a landscape where every additional weight carried on a journey represented a potential threat to survival, the decision to transport rocks for ritual purposes suggests beliefs that were fundamental to Garamantian identity as their civilization declined. The Garamantes didn't simply disappear, they transformed. Some integrated with Tuareg groups who were beginning to dominate the trans-Saharan trade routes. Others moved eastward toward the Nile Valley, where their specialized knowledge of desert survival and navigation found new applications. Still, others may have moved southward, carrying their technological innovations into regions where they could find more sustainable water sources. But something irreplaceable was lost when the great Garamantian settlements were finally abandoned. The Foggerus systems, requiring constant maintenance and specialized knowledge to operate, gradually fell into disrepair. The astronomical traditions, dependent on continuous observation and oral transmission, were disrupted as communities scattered. The trade networks, dependent on trust relationships built up over generations, couldn't survive the political instability that followed environmental collapse. Modern attempts to understand Garamantian technology have met with mixed success. Engineers studying the Foggera remains are impressed by their sophistication but struggle to understand how they were constructed without modern surveying equipment. The tunnels follow water-bearing strata with a precision that seems to require knowledge of geology that supposedly wasn't available to ancient peoples. Some researchers have proposed that the Garamantes possessed dowsing techniques for detecting underground water using subtle environmental cues that modern science doesn't fully understand. Others suggest that they developed their knowledge through centuries of careful observation and experimentation, building up a practical understanding of hydrology that was encoded in oral traditions rather than written texts. Whatever the source of their knowledge, the Garamantes achieved something that seems almost impossible. They created a sustainable urban civilization in one of the world's most challenging environments, and they maintained it for over 1,000 years. Their eventual decline wasn't due to any failure of engineering or organization, but to environmental changes that would have challenged any technology available to ancient peoples. In the silence of the modern Sahara, where tourists now pay hundreds of dollars for brief glimpses of unspoiled desert, the legacy of the Garamantes whispers in languages that few still understand. The Tuareg guides who lead these expeditions carry fragments of Garamantian knowledge in their navigation techniques. Their understanding of seasonal weather patterns, their ability to find water in landscapes that appear completely barren. These fragments of ancient wisdom survive not in books or monuments, but in practices so fundamental they seem like instinct. The ability to read the subtle color changes in sand that indicate the presence of underground moisture, the knowledge of which plants can provide emergency water and which will cause poisoning, the understanding of wind patterns that allows navigation when all other landmarks disappear. Modern GPS systems and satellite communications have made desert travel safer and more predictable, but they've also created a kind of amnesia about the sophisticated knowledge systems that made such travel possible for thousands of years before the advent of electronic technology. The loss of this knowledge represents more than just historical curiosities, the disappearance of entire ways of understanding and relating to the natural world. The Garamantian understanding of water was fundamentally different from modern approaches to hydrology, where contemporary engineering sees water as a resource to be extracted and controlled. The Garamantes seem to have seen water as a partner in an ongoing relationship that required constant attention and reciprocity. Their Foggera systems weren't just extraction technologies, they were maintenance systems that required communities to understand and work with natural water cycles rather than simply exploiting them. This difference in approach may explain why Garamantian water systems functioned sustainably for centuries, while many modern attempts at desert agriculture have failed within decades. The Garamantes built their civilization around the capacity of their environment, rather than trying to transform the environment to match their ambitions. When that capacity changed due to climate shift, they adapted rather than trying to fight. The changes, the astronomical knowledge of the Garamantes, presents similar contrasts with modern approaches to celestial observation, where contemporary astronomy seeks to understand the universe as an abstract system governed by mathematical laws. Garamantian astronomy was fundamentally practical and relational. Stars weren't distant objects to be studied, but intimate guides for navigation, seasonal markers for agricultural planning, spiritual presences that connected earthly activities to cosmic rhythms. This integrated approach to knowledge, practical skills, spiritual beliefs, and scientific observation formed a unified understanding of the world may have been the Garamantes' greatest achievement. In an era when specialized knowledge is increasingly fragmented, when technical expertise is divorced from ethical considerations, when scientific understanding is separated from spiritual meaning, the Garamantian example suggests possibilities for more holistic approaches to learning and living. The trade networks that the Garamantes facilitated also offer insights relevant to contemporary discussions about globalization and cultural exchange. The trans-Saharan trade routes weren't just economic systems, they were channels for the exchange of ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and spiritual practices. But, unlike modern global commerce, these exchanges seem to have strengthened rather than homogenized local cultures. Garamantian settlements show influences from across Africa and the Mediterranean, but they maintained distinctive local characteristics that set them apart from both their trading partners and their neighbors. They borrowed techniques and adapted them to local conditions, incorporated foreign artistic elements into indigenous patterns, welcomed foreign merchants while maintaining their own economic independence. This ability to remain open to outside influence while maintaining cultural integrity may have been crucial to Garamantian survival in a challenging environment. In a landscape where resources were limited and conditions unpredictable, the ability to learn from others while maintaining one's own identity provided adaptive flexibility that purely isolationist or completely assimilationist approaches would have lacked. The eventual disappearance of Garamantian civilization raises questions that extend far beyond archaeology or ancient history. In an era of accelerating climate change, when many contemporary communities are facing environmental challenges that threaten their traditional ways of life, the Garamantian experience offers both inspiration and warning. The inspiration lies in their demonstration that sustainable civilizations can flourish in environments that seem hostile to human habitation. Their engineering achievements, their social organization, their cultural accomplishments, all show what becomes possible when human creativity is focused on working with rather than against natural systems. The warning lies in their ultimate vulnerability to environmental changes beyond their control. Despite their technological sophistication and their deep understanding of their environment, the Garamantes couldn't survive the climate shifts that dried up their water sources. Their fate suggests that even the most well-adapted civilizations remain dependent on environmental conditions that can change in ways that make traditional survival strategies obsolete. But perhaps the most important lesson from Garamantian history is the recognition that civilizations don't simply disappear, transform. The knowledge, skills, and cultural values that sustained Garamantian society for over a millennium didn't vanish when their cities were abandoned. They survived in modified forms among the peoples who inherited their territories in the trading practices that continued along modified routes, in the oral traditions that preserved fragments of their understanding today. As archaeologists work to piece together the fragments of Garamantian civilization, they're not just recovering ancient history, they're recovering alternative approaches to fundamental human challenges. How do we create sustainable relationships with challenging environments? How do we maintain cultural identity while remaining open to beneficial change? How do we develop knowledge systems that integrate practical skills with spiritual understanding? These questions become more urgent as contemporary societies face environmental and social challenges that may require precisely the kinds of adaptive strategies that the Garamantes developed. Their example suggests that the solutions to contemporary problems may not lie in the development of ever more sophisticated technologies, but in the recovery of more holistic approaches to understanding and relating to the world. The silence that now covers the former Garamantian territories isn't empty, it's pregnant with possibilities. In that silence, careful listeners can still hear the echo of ancient wisdom, still sense the presence of knowledge systems that understood the desert not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a teacher to be learned from, a partner to be worked with, a sacred space to be honored and protected. As the night settles over the Sahara, as the stars emerge in patterns that Garamantian astronomers once mapped with such precision, the desert remembers. In the wind that moves across abandoned settlements, in the underground channels that still carry traces of ancient water, in the navigation skills of modern nomads who follow routes first established by Garamantian traders, the civilization lives on not as monument or museum piece, but as living wisdom that continues to sustain life in one of the world's most challenging environments. And in that continuity, in that quiet persistence of knowledge and adaptation across centuries of change, there whispers the promise that no wisdom is ever truly lost, that every civilization that learns to live sustainably within its environment leaves gifts that continue to nourish future generations. Even when the names of the givers have been forgotten and their cities have returned to sand, the wind that once carried Etruscan voices across the hills of central Italy now whispers other names, other stories that drift like smoke through the corridors of time. In the silence left by one forgotten people, the echoes of countless others begin to rise. Each civilization a thread in the vast tapestry of human memory that has been torn, mended, and torn again by the passage of millennia. There are peoples whose names we know only from the frightened records of those they conquered, whose languages survive in fragments carved into stone by trembling hands, whose gods have been reduced to mysterious symbols that archaeologists puzzle over in the sterile light of modern laboratories. These are the unknown peoples of the ancient world, the civilizations that rose and fell in the spaces between the stories we think we know, the cultures that lived and loved and built and dreamed in the shadows cast by the great empires of history, from the Mediterranean shores where the sea peoples once brought terror to the mightiest kingdoms of the Bronze Age, to the misty highlands of Scotland where the Picts carved their enigmatic symbols into standing stones, to the sun-baked valleys of Anatolia where the Hittites built an empire that rivaled Egypt and Mesopotamia before vanishing into the dust of history. The ancient world was populated by peoples whose stories have been lost to time, whose voices have been silenced by the weight of centuries. but in the quiet moments between waking and sleeping, when the mind softens and the barriers between past and present begin to dissolve, these voices can still be heard. They speak in the whisper of wind through ancient ruins, in the rhythm of waves against forgotten shores, in the shadows that dance across the walls of abandoned temples. They tell stories of love and loss, of triumph and tragedy, of the eternal human struggle to build something lasting in a world that seems determined to forget. In the dying light of the Bronze Age, when the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean had reached the height of their power and glory, a shadow fell across the ancient world. It came from the sea, carried on ships whose design was unknown to the coastal peoples who watched in terror as the vessels approached their shores. The occupants of these ships would come to be known simply as the Sea Peoples, a confederation of tribes and nations whose origins remain one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. The year was approximately 1200 BC, and the world was about to change forever. The Sea Peoples did not come as merchants or diplomats, but as warriors and raiders, bringing with them a new kind of warfare that the established powers of the age were unprepared to face. They moved like a storm across the Mediterranean, leaving destruction in their wake, toppling kingdoms and empires that had stood for centuries. The Egyptian records speak of them with a mixture of fear and fascination. The scribes of Pharaoh Ramses III described them as peoples who came from their islands in the midst of the sea, warriors who fought with bronze swords and spears, who wore distinctive feathered headdresses and horned helmets, who brought their families with them in ox-drawn carts, suggesting not mere raiding but a great migration of entire peoples. The names that survive in the Egyptian hieroglyphs read like a roll call of the unknown. The Pelesit, who may have been the ancestors of the Philistines, the Jekka, the Shekelash, the Danaan, the Weshash. Each name represents a people with their own culture, their own language, their own dreams and fears and hopes. Yet for all their impact on history, they remain shadows, their stories lost to time. What drove them from their homelands remains a mystery. Some scholars suggest that climate change, a cooling and drying of the Mediterranean world, may have forced them to seek new lands. Others point to internal conflicts, to the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization in Greece, to the mysterious destruction of Troy, to the fall of the Hittite Empire. Perhaps it was a combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of environmental and political catastrophe that set in motion one of history's great migrations. The Sea Peoples' impact on the ancient world cannot be overstated. They were instrumental in the collapse of the Bronze Age civilization, the end of an era that had lasted for over a millennium. The great palace complexes of the Mycenaeans were burned and abandoned. The trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world were severed. Cities that had thrived for centuries were left in ruins. Yet in their destruction, the Sea Peoples also brought transformation. They introduced new technologies, new ways of thinking, new forms of organization. The Iron Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was in many ways their gift to the world. A new chapter in human history that would see the rise of the Greeks, the Romans, the peoples who would shape the ancient world in ways that still echo today. The Philistines, descendants of the Pelesit, would establish themselves in the coastal cities of Canaan, where they would become the arch-enemies of the Israelites, the people of Goliath whom David slew with a stone. Their cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, would become centers of culture and trade, their pottery and metalwork spreading throughout the Levant. But even as they settled and built new lives, the Sea Peoples remained aliens in their adopted lands. Their origins a mystery that would perplex scholars for millennia to come. They brought with them cultural practices that were foreign to the lands they conquered, artistic styles that archaeologists struggle to trace to their source, religious beliefs that seem to have vanished without a trace. In the ruins of their settlements, archaeologists have found evidence of a sophisticated culture, finely crafted pottery decorated with birds and fish, bronze weapons of exquisite workmanship, seals and amulets bearing symbols whose meaning has been lost. They were not mere barbarians destroying civilization, but a people with their own rich cultural traditions, their own ways of understanding the world. The mystery of the sea peoples deepens when we consider their apparent knowledge of naval warfare and long-distance navigation. They were able to coordinate attacks across vast distances, to maintain supply lines across the Mediterranean, to adapt their tactics to the specific defenses of each target. This suggests a level of organization and communication that was remarkable for the time, a sophisticated understanding of logistics and strategy that speaks to a complex society. Some scholars have suggested that the sea peoples may have originated in the Aegean world, refugees from the collapse of Mycenaean civilization who took to the sea in search of new homes. Others point to possible connections with the peoples of Anatolia, the Italian peninsula, or even the Western Mediterranean. The truth may be that the sea peoples were not a single people at all, but a coalition of different groups united by circumstance and necessity. The archaeological evidence is tantalizingly incomplete. At sites like Medinet Habu in Egypt, we can see the Egyptian artists' depictions of the sea peoples, their distinctive clothing and weapons, their ships with their high prows and stern posts. But these are the images of enemies filtered through the lens of Egyptian propaganda and artistic convention. We can never know how accurately they represent the real appearance of these mysterious peoples. In the end, the sea peoples vanished from history as suddenly as they had appeared. Some were defeated by the Egyptians, others settled in the lands they had conquered, still others may have sailed on to unknown destinations, but their impact on the ancient world was profound and lasting. They were the catalyst for the collapse of the Bronze Age and the birth of the Iron Age, the agents of destruction who cleared the way for new civilizations to rise. As we drift towards sleep, we might imagine their ships appearing on the horizon, their bronze weapons glinting in the Mediterranean sun, their voices calling across the waves in languages we will never understand. They were the unknown peoples of the ancient world, the shadow figures who changed the course of history and then disappeared into the mists of time, leaving behind only questions and the echo of their passing dot in the mist-shrouded highlands of Scotland, where the heather blooms purple in the brief summer and the wind carries the scent of the sea across ancient stone. There lived a people whose very name has become synonymous with mystery. The Picts, as they came to be known, were the painted warriors of the north, the guardians of the last frontier of the known world, the people who stood firm against the might of Rome when even the fierce Celtic tribes of Gaul had fallen. The name Pict itself is a Roman construction derived from the Latin picti, meaning painted ones. It was a term born of fear and fascination, used by Roman soldiers who had glimpsed these warriors in battle, their bodies covered in intricate tattoos or paint, their faces transformed into masks of war. But what the Picts called themselves, what name they spoke in their own tongue around their fires at night, remains unknown to us. The Picts inhabited the lands north of the Fourth Clyde Line, a region that the Romans would call Caledonia, a territory of mountains and forests, lochs and glens. where the remnants of an ancient way of life persisted long after the Roman legions had retreated south. Here, in the shadow of the great stone circles and burial mounds left by their ancestors, the Picts maintained their independence for over 1,000 years. What we know of Pictish society comes to us in fragments, gleaned from archaeological excavations, from the hostile accounts of Roman historians, from the later chronicles of their Celtic neighbors. It is a picture assembled from broken pieces, a puzzle with many missing parts. Yet even these fragments reveal a sophisticated culture, a people who were far from the barbarians their enemies portrayed them as. The Picts were skilled metalworkers, creating elaborate silver chains and brooches, bronze mirrors decorated with intricate patterns, weapons that were both functional and beautiful. They were accomplished artists, carving symbols into stone with a precision and artistry that speaks to a long tradition of craftsmanship. They were builders, constructing fortified settlements called brugs, circular towers that could withstand siege and provide refuge for entire communities. But perhaps most intriguingly, the Picts were the creators of one of history's most enigmatic art forms, the Simbel stones. Scattered across the Scottish Highlands are hundreds of standing stones, some dating back to the 5th century CE, carved with a bewildering array of symbols whose meaning has been lost to time. These symbols, the crescent and virod, the double disc and zirod, the flower and the mirror, appear again and again across Pictish territory, suggesting a system of communication or belief that was shared across their entire culture. The symbols have been interpreted in countless ways. Some scholars see them as commemorative markers, stones erected to honor the dead or to mark important events. Others suggest they are territorial markers, boundary stones that defined the extent of clan lands. Still others believe they are religious symbols, representations of gods or goddesses, or perhaps elements of a complex mythology that has been forgotten. What makes the Pictish symbols particularly mysterious is their apparent systematization. They appear to follow certain rules, certain patterns of combination that suggest an underlying logic. Some symbols almost always appear together, others never do. Some are always oriented in the same direction, others are always reversed. It is as if the Picts had developed a complex language of stone, a way of encoding information that could be read by those who knew the key. The Picts' military prowess was legendary. They were the people who turned back the Roman legions at Mons. Gropius, who harassed the builders of Hadrian's Wall, who made the far north of Britain a place of terror for Roman soldiers. Their warriors were renowned for their ferocity in battle, their mastery of guerrilla warfare, their ability to appear and disappear like ghosts in the highland mists. Roman historians describe Pictish warriors as tall and fair, with long hair and beards, their bodies covered in tattoos that depicted animals and abstract designs. They fought with long swords and small shields, their tactics adapted to the rough terrain of their homeland. They were horsemen and charioteers, skilled in the arts of war that had been passed down through generations of conflict. But the Picts were more than just warriors. They were farmers and herders, living in a landscape that was both harsh and beautiful, extracting sustenance from soil that was often poor and rocky. They were traders, their goods reaching as far as the Mediterranean, their amber and furs prized by merchants across Europe. They were storytellers and musicians, keeping alive the oral traditions that linked them to their ancestors. The Pictish kings ruled from fortified strongholds, their authority extending across a confederation of tribes that controlled much of northern Scotland. The succession to the throne followed a complex system that may have been matrilineal, with kings chosen not from among the sons of the previous ruler, but from among his nephews or other male relatives through the female line. This system, unusual in early medieval Europe, may have been a survival from an ancient Celtic tradition. The Picts' encounter with Christianity was gradual and complex. St. Columba, the Irish missionary, established his monastery on the island of Iona in the 6th century, and from there, the new faith began to spread into Pictish territory. But the Picts did not simply abandon their old ways. Instead, they adapted Christianity to their own traditions, creating a unique synthesis that can be seen in their art and architecture. The great Pictish cross slabs that survive today are testaments to this cultural fusion. These massive stones, some standing over 10 feet tall, combine Christian symbols with traditional Pictish motifs. The cross is surrounded by scenes from the Bible, but these are interwoven with the ancient symbols of Pictish culture, creating a visual language that speaks to both faiths. The most famous of these cross slabs is the Abelemno stone, which depicts a great battle scene that may represent the Pictish victory over the Northumbrians at Nectansmere. In 685 CE, the stone shows warriors in mail shirts fighting with swords and shields, ravens picking at the bodies of the fallen, all carved with a skill and attention to detail that rivals the finest medieval manuscripts. Yet, for all their achievements, the Picts were destined to disappear from history. In the 9th century, Kenneth MacAlpin, a king with both Pictish and Scottish heritage, united the Picts and Scots under a single crown. The Pictish language gradually gave way to Gaelic. Their customs were absorbed into the broader Scottish culture. Their distinctive identity was lost by the 10th century. The Picts had ceased to exist as a separate people. Their language died out. Their symbols were no longer carved. Their ancient traditions were forgotten. They became a memory, a legend, a subject for romantic speculation. The painted warriors of the north had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. But the Picts left behind traces of their presence that time cannot erase. In the symbol stones that still stand in highland fields, in the brocks that crown isolated hilltops, in the genetic heritage of the Scottish people, the Picts live on. They are the unknown people who held the line against Rome, who created one of Europe's most mysterious art forms, who adapted to a changing world while maintaining their essential identity until the very end. As the night deepens and the mind begins to wander toward sleep, we might imagine the Picts gathered around their fires in the Highland glens, their painted faces glowing in the firelight, their voices raised in songs whose melodies we will never hear. They were the guardians of the North, the keepers of ancient wisdom, the painted warriors who chose to remain unknown rather than surrender their freedom. In the mist that rises from the Scottish lochs, in the cry of the wind across the moors, their spirits still roam, forever free, forever mysterious, forever lost to time, in the wild mountains of southeastern Europe, where the Balkan peaks pierce the sky and ancient forests whisper secrets in languages older than memory. There lived a people whose name would become synonymous with both savagery and sublime artistry. The Thracians were the children of the northern winds, the descendants of tribes that had roamed the steppes and settled in the valleys where Europe meets Asia, where the civilized world gave way to the realm of the barbarians, to the Greeks, who were their neighbors to the south. The Thracians were a paradox wrapped in contradiction. They were fierce warriors who fought for gold and glory, yet they were also the people who had given birth to Orpheus, the mythical musician whose songs could charm the very stones. They were tribal societies that seemed primitive to Greek eyes, Yet they produced some of the most exquisite goldwork the ancient world had ever seen. They were barbarians who practiced human sacrifice, yet they were also the guardians of mystery religions that promised immortality to the initiated. The Thracian lands stretched from the Danube in the north to the Aegean Sea in the south, from the Black Sea in the east to the mountains of Macedonia in the west. It was a vast territory of diverse landscapes and peoples, united more by a shared way of life than by any central authority. The Thracians were divided into numerous tribes: the Geti, the Dacians, the Odrysians, the Bessi, each with their own traditions and customs, their own kings and warriors, their own relationships with the gods. The Greeks first encountered the Thracians in the earliest days of their civilization, when bold adventurers sailed across the Aegean in search of new lands and new opportunities. What they found was a people who seemed to embody all their fears and fantasies about the barbarian world. The Thracians were tall and fair, with long hair and beards, their bodies covered in tattoos that marked their tribal affiliations and their achievements in war. They were horsemen and warriors, living in a world where strength and courage were the highest virtues. But the Greeks also discovered that the Thracians possessed a spiritual sophistication that rivaled their own. The Thracian religion was centered around the worship of gods who ruled over life and death, gods who could grant immortality to those who knew the proper rituals and possessed the necessary wisdom. The most important of these deities was Zalmoxis, a god-king who was said to have descended into the underworld and returned with the secrets of eternal life. The cult of Zalmoxis was unlike anything the Greeks had encountered. According to the historian Herodotus, the Thracians believed that death was merely a journey to another realm, where the souls of the faithful would be reunited with their god. To prove their faith, they would select a messenger every 4 years, choosing him by lot from among the most righteous of their number. This unfortunate individual would be killed in a ritual ceremony, his body pierced with spears and his soul sent to carry messages to Zalmoxis in the underworld. This practice horrified the Greeks, who saw it as evidence of Thracian barbarism. But it also fascinated them, for it suggested a level of spiritual conviction that was rare in the ancient world. The Thracians were willing to die for their beliefs, to sacrifice everything for the promise of immortality. This was a kind of faith that the Greeks, with their more intellectual approach to religion, could barely comprehend. The influence of Thracian spirituality on Greek culture was profound and lasting. The mystery religions that became so important in the later Greek world, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Dionysiac cults, the Orphic traditions, all showed clear signs of Thracian influence. The idea of the soul's journey through death to a blessed afterlife, the use of initiation rituals to grant access to divine secrets, the belief in the power of music and poetry to bridge the gap between the mortal and divine worlds, all of these concepts had their roots in Thracian soil. Orpheus himself, the legendary musician who could charm even the stones and trees with his songs, was said to be according to Greek mythology, he was the son of Ogyges, a Thracian king, and Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. His music was so beautiful that it could stop rivers in their course, make wild beasts lie down in peace, and even move the gods themselves to tears. When his beloved Eurydice died from a snake bite, Orpheus descended into the underworld to bring her back, his songs softening the hearts of Hades and Persephone. The myth of Orpheus reflected the Thracian belief in the power of music to transcend the boundaries between life and death. The Thracians were great lovers of music and poetry, and their bards were respected figures who preserved the oral traditions of their people. These singer-poets were not mere entertainers, but shamanic figures who could communicate with the spirit world, who could guide souls through the dangerous passages of death and rebirth. The Orphic mysteries that developed from these traditions promised initiates a blessed afterlife, free from the cycle of death and rebirth that trapped ordinary souls. The Orphic texts, written on gold tablets and buried with the dead, provided a kind of roadmap for the soul's journey through the underworld. These tablets contained passwords and secret formulas that would allow the deceased to navigate the perils of the afterlife and achieve divine status. The Thracians were also renowned for their skill in metallurgy and their love of gold. The mountains of Thrace were rich in precious metals, and Thracian craftsmen developed sophisticated techniques for working gold and silver. They created elaborate headdresses, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that displayed a level of artistry that impressed even the Greeks. The golden treasures found in Thracian tombs, cups and bowls, diadems and bracelets, horse harnesses and sword hilts, represent some of the finest metalwork to survive from the ancient world. Perhaps the most famous of these treasures is the Panegyrished treasure, discovered in Bulgaria in 1949. This collection of golden vessels, dating to the 4th century BCE, includes a series of drinking cups shaped like the heads of women and animals, decorated with scenes from Greek mythology. The craftsmanship is exquisite, the gold work rivaling anything produced in the great centers of Greek civilization. Yet the style is distinctly Thracian, combining Greek motifs with native traditions to create something entirely unique. The Thracian relationship with their Greek neighbors was complex and often volatile. They served as mercenaries in Greek armies, their fierce reputation making them sought-after warriors. The Thracian peltasts, lightly armed soldiers who fought with javelins and small shields, became a standard component of Greek military forces. Yet the Thracians also raided Greek settlements, their horsemen sweeping down from the mountains to carry off slaves and plunder. The most famous Thracian in Greek history was Spartacus, the gladiator who led the great slave rebellion against Rome in the 1st century BCE. Spartacus was a Thracian warrior who had been captured and forced to fight in the Roman arenas. When he escaped and raised the banner of revolt, he drew upon his Thracian heritage, using the guerrilla tactics of his people to outmaneuver the Roman legions. For 2 years, his army of slaves and outcasts held its own against the might of Rome, a testament to Thracian military prowess and the power of the barbarian spirit. But the Thracians were not merely warriors and mystics. They were also farmers and herders, living in settled communities and practicing agriculture. They built fortified settlements on hilltops, surrounded by stone walls and defended by warrior bands. These settlements were centers of trade and craft production, where Thracian metalworkers created their masterpieces and Thracian merchants traded with the outside world. The Thracian economy was based on a combination of agriculture, pastoralism, and mining. They raised cattle and horses, grew grain and grapes, and extracted gold and silver from their mountain mines. They were also skilled hunters, pursuing the wild boar, deer, and bears that roamed their forests. The wealth that flowed from these activities supported a warrior aristocracy that delighted in display and ceremony. Thracian society was organized around the institution of the warband, groups of young warriors who served under a chosen leader. These bands were bound together by oaths of loyalty and codes of honor that emphasized courage, generosity, and fidelity. The warband was both a military and a social institution, providing young men with a pathway to status and wealth, while serving the broader community as a defensive force. The Thracian kings ruled over confederations of tribes. Their authority based on their success in war and their ability to distribute wealth to their followers. They lived in fortified palaces, surrounded by retainers and servants, their courts centers of artistic and cultural activity. The royal tombs that archaeologists have excavated reveal the extent of their wealth and power, filled with golden treasures, fine pottery, and the remains of sacrificed horses and retainers. Yet for all their achievements, the Thracians were destined to be absorbed into the larger currents of ancient history. The rise of Macedon, under Philip II and Alexander the Great, brought the Thracian tribes under Greek influence. The Roman conquest of the Balkans in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE ended Thracian independence forever. The Thracian language gradually gave way to Latin and Greek. Their traditions were forgotten. Their gods were replaced by Roman deities. By the end of the ancient period, the Thracians had vanished as a distinct people. Their descendants became Romans. Their lands were incorporated into the Roman provinces of Thrace and Mysia. Their culture was absorbed into the broader Mediterranean world. The fierce warriors who had once roamed the Balkan mountains were transformed into Roman citizens, their ancient traditions surviving only in the mystery religions that promised immortality to the initiated. But the Thracians left behind more than golden treasures and ruined fortresses. They left behind a vision of the human spirit that transcended the boundaries of life and death. A belief in the power of music and poetry to transform the world, a legacy of artistic achievement that continues to inspire wonder and admiration. In the golden cups of panegyric, in the haunting melodies of Orphic hymns, in the courage of Spartacus and his followers, the Thracian spirit lives on, a reminder of the wild freedom that once flourished in the mountains of the north. As sleep approaches, and the conscious mind begins to fade, we might imagine the Thracian bards singing their ancient songs around the fires of their mountain strongholds, their voices carrying across the valleys and peaks, calling to the gods who ruled over life and death. They were the unknown people, who gave music to the world, who promised immortality to those who dared to seek it, who showed that even barbarians could touch the divine. In the wind that blows across the Balkan mountains, in the gold that glints in mountain streams, their spirits still wander, forever singing, forever seeking, forever free. The keeper of memories had spoken her final words into the dying embers. And now the silence that followed was not empty but full, pregnant with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that would never be spoken again. In that profound quiet, the very air seemed to shimmer with the ghosts of ancient voices, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of human experience that was slowly unraveling beneath the relentless march of time. The fire crackled lower, its orange glow casting dancing shadows across the faces of those who remained, each one marked by the solemnity of what they had witnessed. These were the final guardians of knowledge so old that even they could not remember its origins, keepers of truths that predated written language, custodians of wisdom that had been passed from mouth to ear in an unbroken chain stretching back to the very dawn of human consciousness. Yet tonight, that chain would be broken forever. In the hills beyond their dying settlement, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of renewal. But for the vanished ones, as they would come to be known in the fragmentary records of distant civilizations, renewal was no longer possible. Their time was ending, not with the violence of conquest or the suddenness of catastrophe, but with the quiet dignity of acceptance, the recognition that all things, no matter how sacred or enduring they might seem, must eventually return to The silence from which they came, the rituals they had performed for countless generations, would be performed no more. The songs they had sung to welcome the dawn and bid farewell to the setting sun would fade into memory and then into nothingness. The intricate dances that had once woven together the living and the dead, the human and the divine, the temporal and the eternal, would be danced no more. All of this was ending, and those who remained knew it with the profound clarity that comes only in the final moments of a dying age. Yet there was no despair in their acceptance, no bitter railing against the inevitable. Instead, there was something deeper recognition that their passing was part of a larger pattern, a cosmic rhythm that had seen countless civilizations rise and fall, flourish and fade, leave their mark upon the world and then disappear into the vast ocean of forgotten time. They were but one note in an infinite symphony, one wave in an endless sea, one breath in the eternal respiration of history itself did in the sacred grove where their ancestors had once gathered to commune with. The spirits of the earth, the last of the stone singers, prepared for their final ceremony. These were the men and women who had learned to speak the ancient language of rock and crystal, who could coax music from granite and melody from marble, who had discovered that the very bones of the earth held within them the memory of all that had ever been. Their art was beyond the comprehension of the younger civilizations that had begun to spread across the known world. Where others saw only lifeless stone, the stone singers perceived a living symphony, each mineral formation a note in a vast composition that had been playing since the world was young. They had learned to harmonize with this ancient music, to add their voices to the eternal song of the earth itself, creating resonances that could heal the sick, calm the troubled, and open doorways between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. But the knowledge required to master such arts could not be written down or preserved in any conventional manner. It lived only in the bodies and souls of those who had devoted their entire lives to its cultivation, passed from teacher to student through years of patient instruction and careful guidance. It was a living tradition, as fragile as it was ancient. And now that tradition was dying with the last of its practitioners, the eldest among them, a woman whose hair had long since turned the color of moonlight, and whose eyes held the deep patience of geological time, placed her weathered hands upon the great standing stone that had served as the heart of their ceremonies for more generations than anyone could count. As her palms made contact with the ancient granite, a subtle vibration began to pulse through the earth, felt rather than heard, sensed rather than seen. The other stone singers formed a circle around her, their own hands raised toward the stone, their voices joining in a harmony that seemed to emerge from the very bedrock beneath their feet. The sound they made was unlike anything produced by a human throat or tongue. It was the voice of the mountain itself, the song of deep places where pressure and time had transformed simple minerals into something approaching consciousness, the whisper of granite dreams that had been dreaming since the first rocks cooled from molten fire. As their song continued, other stones throughout the grove began to respond, each one adding its own voice to the growing symphony. The sound was felt as much as heard, a deep thrumming that seemed to originate from the core of the earth and rise through layers of soil and stone until it emerged into the night air as something that touched the soul directly, bypassing the ears entirely. It was the sound of farewell, not the sharp grief of sudden loss, but the deep, rolling sadness of an ending that had been long foreseen and quietly accepted. In distant lands, beyond the reach of the stone singer's final song, other remnants of the vanished ones were preparing their own farewells. In the vast desert where their ancestors had once read the future in the patterns of shifting sand, the last of the windwalkers gathered their few remaining possessions and prepared to walk into the trackless wastes, following paths that existed only in memory and legend. These were the nomads who had learned to navigate not by the stars or the sun, but by the subtle voices of the wind itself. They could read in the movement of air currents the location of distant oases, the approach of sandstorms days before they arrived, the presence of other travelers beyond the horizon. Their knowledge was as vast as the desert they called home, encompassing not only the practical skills of survival in one of the world's most unforgiving environments, but also the deeper mysteries of air and atmosphere, breath and spirit. They had been the first to discover that the wind carried more than just sand and the scent of rain. It carried messages, whispers from far-off places, the dreams of sleeping cities, the prayers of distant pilgrims. They had learned to listen to these aerial messengers, to decode their meanings, to send their own messages riding on the backs of favorable breezes. Their network of communication had once spanned continents, allowing them to know of events in distant lands long before any earthbound messenger could bring word. But now the winds brought only silence, or perhaps more accurately, they brought the sounds of a world that no longer had room for the old ways. The voices that had once whispered secrets on the evening breeze were being drowned out by the clamor of expanding cities, the clash of bronze weapons, the grinding of wheels along newly carved roads, the ancient conversation between earth and sky, mediated by those who understood the language of both, was being interrupted by the urgent demands of a younger, louder world. As the last windwalkers prepared to depart, they performed one final ritual of communication, sending out a message that would ride the high currents and circle the globe, carrying word of their passing to any who still retained the ears to hear it. The message was simple. We were here, we listened, we understood. Remember us in the whisper of the wind. Then they turned their faces toward the deep desert, toward places where no roads led and no cities would ever rise, and they began to walk. Behind them, the wind erased their footprints almost as quickly as they were made, but those who knew how to read the deeper signs could still sense their passage in the subtle patterns of the air, the way certain breezes seemed to carry an extra measure of sadness, the manner in which the evening wind sometimes seemed to sigh with the voice of distant farewells in the northern forests, where the trees grew so tall and thick that even at midday the ground remained in perpetual twilight. The root speakers performed their own ritual of ending. These were the people who had learned to commune with the vast network of fungal threads that connected every tree in the forest, the underground internet of root and mycorrhiza that allowed the woodland to function as a single, vast, thinking organism. Their understanding of the forest mind had taken them centuries to develop. They had learned that trees were not the solitary individuals they appeared to be, but rather nodes in a vast network of communication and mutual support. Through the fungal threads that connected root to root, trees could share nutrients with their struggling neighbors, send warnings of approaching danger, even transfer the accumulated wisdom of centuries to their offspring before they died. The root speakers had discovered how to tap into this network, to join their own consciousness with the slow, deep thoughts of the forest collective. In doing so, they had gained access to a repository of memory that stretched back far beyond the beginning of human civilization. The forest remembered the ice ages, the coming and going of vanished species, the rise and fall of mountains, the patient work of rivers carving new courses through ancient stone. But perhaps most remarkably, The forest remembered other civilizations' peoples, who had lived among the trees so long ago that their names had been forgotten even by the most ancient. Human traditions. The root speakers had learned to access these memories, to walk in spirit through the ghostly ruins of settlements that had crumbled to nothing millennia before the first Pharaoh ruled in Egypt, to witness the daily lives of peoples whose existence had left no trace in the archaeological record. Through the forest mind, they had discovered that the pattern of rise and fall, growth and decay, was far older and more universal than anyone had imagined. Civilization after civilization had bloomed and withered, each one convinced of its own permanence, each one ultimately returning to the soil from which it had emerged. The forest had watched them all, patient and impartial, absorbing their remains and transforming them into new growth, new possibilities, new dreams taking root in the rich earth of the past. Now the root speakers themselves were facing the same fate that had befallen all those forgotten peoples. The young civilizations spreading across the world had no patience for the slow wisdom of the forest. They saw the great trees not as living libraries or repositories of ancient memory, but as obstacles to be cleared, resources to be harvested, problems to be solved with axe and fire dot. As the last root speakers gathered in the heart of the ancient forest, they performed one final communion with the woodland mind, placing their hands upon the massive trunk of the great mother tree, giant, so old that she had been ancient when the first root speakers learned to hear her voice. They opened their consciousness to the vast network one last time, allowing their own memories and knowledge to flow into the fungal web that connected all things. In this way, something of their wisdom would survive, encoded in the living memory of the forest itself. Future generations might lose the key to accessing this repository, but the information would remain, waiting in the patient darkness beneath the earth for someone to rediscover the language of root and fungus, soil and stone. The trees would remember them as they had remembered all the others who had come before. Far to the south, in the coastal regions where the great rivers emptied into the wind-dark sea, the tide readers stood at the edge of the world, watching the eternal dance of water and shore. These were the people who had learned to see in the rhythm of the waves not merely the mechanical motion of liquid against solid, but a vast and complex language that spoke of currents far beyond the horizon, of weather patterns forming in distant oceans, of the deep movements of the earth itself as it breathed through the medium of the sea. Their knowledge encompassed far more than simple navigation or weather prediction. They had discovered that the ocean held within its depths a memory as vast and ancient as the forest mind, a liquid library that recorded every drop of rain that had ever fallen, every tear that had ever been shed, every drop of blood that had ever been spilled. The sea remembered everything, and those who knew how to listen could hear in its voice the entire history of water on Earth. From the first rains that fell on the cooling planet to the final drops that would evaporate when the sun grew old and red. Through their communion with the tide readers had gained access to visions that spanned both space and time. They could see distant shores they had never visited, witness events that had occurred in far-off places, even glimpse possible futures reflected in the play of moonlight on moving water. Their prophetic abilities were legendary among the coastal peoples, but few understood that their predictions came not from supernatural insight, but from their ability to read the complex patterns hidden in the marriage of water and gravity, moon and earth. But like all the other keepers of the ancient wisdom, the tide readers were facing extinction. The new civilizations that were arising along the coasts had different relationships with the sea. where the tide readers saw a living entity worthy of respect and careful study. The newcomers saw only a highway for trade, a source of food to be exploited, a barrier to be crossed or conquered. They built their ships with iron and bronze rather than the carefully selected woods that the tide readers had known would harmonize with the water's own frequency. They navigated by crude instruments rather than by the subtle art of reading wave and wind, tide and current dot, as the last generation of tide readers prepared for their final ceremony. They waded into the warm shallows, where they had first learned to hear the ocean's voice as children. The water rose around them, welcoming them back to the element from which all life had originally emerged. They began to sing, their voices joining with the sound of the waves in a harmony that seemed to encompass all the music the sea had ever made. The crash of storm waves against rocky cliffs, the gentle lapping of calm waters against sandy beaches, the deep bass notes of currents moving through ocean trenches, the high, clear notes of spray caught by the wind. As their song continued, dolphins began to appear in the deeper water beyond the reef, their sleek forms cutting through the waves as they added their own voices to the growing symphony. Whales surfaced in the distance, their ancient calls carrying across miles of open ocean. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries weaving in and out of the human voices below. For one final time, all the children of the sea joined together in a song of farewell that would echo in the ocean's memory long after the last tide reader had returned to the waters from which their ancestors had first emerged in the high mountains, where the air grew thin and the peaks touched the edge of the sky. The sky watchers gathered for their own ceremony of ending. These were the people who had spent countless generations learning to read the subtle language of light and shadow, cloud and clear sky, the movement of celestial bodies, and the play of auroras across the northern darkness. Their knowledge of astronomy was profound, but it went far beyond the simple tracking of stellar positions and planetary motions. They had discovered that the sky was alive, that the space between the stars was not empty vacuum but a medium through which flowed currents of energy and information as complex as any earthbound river system. They had learned to navigate these celestial currents, to read in the colors of sunset and the patterns of cloud formation messages from realms beyond the physical world. Their understanding of the cosmos was both scientific and mystical, grounded in precise observation but reaching toward truths that transcended the merely material dot. Through their centuries of schooling, they had accumulated knowledge that would not be rediscovered by human civilization for thousands of years. They knew the precise length of the year down to fractions of seconds, could predict eclipses centuries in advance, had mapped the slow wobble of the Earth's axis and calculated the vast cycles that governed ice ages and climate change. But more than this, they had learnt to see in the dance of the heavens a reflection of the deeper patterns that governed all existence, the eternal rhythm of expansion and contraction, creation and destruction, order and chaos that played out on scales from the subatomic to the cosmic. Their mountain observatories were marvels of engineering and artistry, stone circles and megalithic alignments that captured and focused cosmic energies in ways that the later civilizations would dismiss as primitive superstition. Each structure was precisely calibrated to resonate with specific celestial frequencies, creating nodes in a vast network that spanned continents and allowed the sky watchers to communicate with their fellows across impossible distances. But now, those observatories would fall silent forever. The knowledge required to maintain and operate them was too complex to be preserved in writing, too subtle to be passed on to anyone who had not spent decades learning the intricate relationships between earth and sky, matter and energy, time and space. As the last skywatchers prepared for their final ceremony, they climbed to the highest peak of their mountain home, to a place where the atmosphere grew so thin that the boundary between earth and heaven seemed to dissolve entirely. There, as the aurora borealis began to dance across the northern sky in sheets of green and gold, they performed their last great working. Using techniques that had been perfected over millennia, they opened themselves to the cosmic currents that flowed between the stars, allowing their consciousness to expand beyond the boundaries of their physical forms, to merge with the vast intelligence that moved through the emptiness of space like thought through the mind of a dreaming god. In that final moment of communion, they experienced a vision that encompassed the entire sweep of cosmic history, birth of galaxies from primordial clouds of gas and dust, the formation of solar systems around young stars, the slow dance of planets in their orbital paths, the emergence of life from the marriage of chemistry and chance. They saw their own civilization as a single, brief note in this vast symphony, beautiful in its moment, but destined to fade into the eternal silence from which all music ultimately emerges. As the aurora reached its peak intensity, the skywatchers released their final breath into the thin mountain air, their consciousness dissolving into the cosmic currents they had studied for so long. Their bodies remained on the peak, gradually covered by snow and ice, but their spirits joined the eternal circulation of energy that flows between the stars, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of their people into the vast library of cosmic memory. And so the vanished ones passed from the world, not with the violence of war or the suddenness of catastrophe, but with the quiet dignity of those who had always known that their time was limited, that their role was to serve as bridges between one age and the next, keepers of truths too ancient and too sacred to survive the harsh scrutiny of a younger, more practical world. In the years that followed their passing, traces of their presence would occasionally surface in the most unexpected places. Archaeologists would puzzle over stone circles whose purpose seemed to transcend their apparent function, wonder at cave paintings that depicted knowledge their creators should not have possessed, struggle to explain artifacts that appeared to incorporate principles of engineering and physics that would not be officially discovered for millennia. Sometimes, in the deep places of the earth, where ancient root systems still whispered in the darkness, sensitive individuals would catch fleeting glimpses of the forest memory, brief visions of civilizations that had flourished and faded long before recorded history began. Others, standing alone on windswept heights or storm-tossed shores, would hear in the voice of the elements faint echoes of the songs that had once woven together earth and sky, water and stone, the living and the dead. But these were only fragments, scattered pieces of a vast puzzle that would never again be assembled in its entirety. The complete knowledge of the vanished ones, their understanding of the subtle connections that bound all things together, their ability to read the hidden languages of nature, their mastery of forces that the later world would barely recognize. As existing, all of this had passed into the realm of legend and dream, becoming part of the great mystery that surrounds the origins of human civilization. Yet perhaps this was as it should be. Perhaps there are some truths too profound to be preserved in the crude vessels of written language, some wisdom too sacred to survive the bright light of analytical scrutiny. Perhaps the real gift of the vanished ones was not the specific knowledge they possessed, but the example they provided, the demonstration that it was possible for human beings to live in harmony with forces far greater than themselves, to find meaning and purpose in serving something beyond their own immediate needs and desires. In the end, they had chosen to fade rather than to fight, to dissolve rather than to dominate, to become part of the eternal silence rather than to add their voices to the growing clamor of a world that no longer had room for mystery or wonder. Their legacy lived on not in monuments or written records, but in the deeper currents of human memory, in the part of the soul that still remembered what it felt like to be fully connected to the living world, to be part of something larger and more enduring than any individual life or civilization. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, when the boundaries between dream and reality grow thin and permeable, those who listen carefully can still hear their voices whispering in the wind, singing in the waves, humming in the deep places where roots touch roots in the darkness, calling from the spaces between the stars where consciousness flows like light through the infinite emptiness of space. They are gone, but they are not forgotten. They are silent, but their silence speaks more eloquently than words. They have passed from the world of the living, but they have not passed from the world of the possible, remaining forever present in the realm of dream and memory, waiting patiently for the day when humanity might once again be ready to hear the ancient songs they sang, to learn the forgotten languages they spoke, to remember the sacred truths they carried in their hearts through all the long centuries of their watching and their waiting. Until that day comes, there ever comes, their story remains incomplete, a mystery wrapped within an enigma, a question that echoes through the corridors of time without ever receiving a final answer. And perhaps that is the most fitting monument to their memory, not a stone carved with their achievements or a book filled with their wisdom, but an eternal question mark hanging in the air, a permanent reminder that there are still mysteries in the world that remain unsolved, still songs waiting to be heard by those who have learned how to listen with their hearts as well as their ears. The last embers of the fire died away completely now, leaving only darkness and the sound of the wind, moving through the empty spaces where their voices had once filled the night with music and meaning. But in that darkness and that silence, something remained, a presence that could not be named or defined, only felt in the deepest places of the soul, where all the ancient memories slept, waiting for the touch that would awaken them once more. In the silence between heartbeats, between the turning of seasons, between the rise and fall of empires, the unknown peoples wait. Their stories drift like morning mist across valleys that have forgotten their names, their wisdom scattered like seeds on ancient winds. The mountain mist clung to terraced gardens where no foot had walked for 1,500 years. Here, in the thin air of the Himalayas, archaeologists found traces of a people who called themselves the Zanskarnat, the modern inhabitants of that name, but an earlier civilization whose very existence had been whispered away by time itself. Their settlements dotted impossible cliff faces, connected by rope bridges whose anchors still bore the weight of memory in stone. These were the keepers of astronomical knowledge that predated Greek calculations by centuries. In caves carved from living rock, their scholar monks had tracked the movements of stars with a precision that would not be matched, again until the age of telescopes. Yet they left no written language that modern minds could decipher, only mathematical symbols etched in silver into monastery walls, calculations that described the dance of celestial bodies with breathtaking accuracy. The Zanskar understood time differently than their contemporaries. While other civilizations marked seasons by the flooding of rivers or the migration of herds, these mountain dwellers calibrated their existence to the great cosmic wheel. They built their meditation halls to align with stellar configurations that occurred once every 26,000 years, as if they expected their descendants to witness phenomena they themselves would never see. Their burial practices spoke of a people who viewed death as merely another calculation in the grand equation of existence. Bodies were not interred, but exposed on platforms built at precise altitudes, where the thin air and intense sunlight would reduce flesh to bone with mathematical predictability. The bones were then ground into powder and mixed with precious metals. Gold dust gleaned from mountain streams, silver hammered from meteors that had fallen in their lifetime. This metallic bone powder was used to create ink for their most sacred texts, manuscripts written on paper made from high-altitude plants that grew only in their secret valleys. When the last Sanskar monastery fell silent, whether from plague, invasion, or some other catastrophe lost to time, these texts were sealed in copper vessels and hidden in caves so remote that some have yet to be found. The few recovered fragments contain star charts of impossible complexity, describing the positions of planets and comets centuries before their predicted appearances. The Zanskar left behind one final mystery that continues to perplex modern astronomers. In a chamber carved directly into a mountain peak, they constructed what appears to be a three-dimensional star map made from precious stones and metals. Each gem represents a specific star, positioned with such accuracy that the entire installation serves as a working model of the night sky as it appeared 2,000 years ago. Yet some of the stones represent stars that were invisible to the naked eye, celestial bodies that could only be detected with modern telescopes. How they knew of their existence remains one of archaeology's most haunting questions, as winter descended upon their high valleys for the final time. The Zanskar performed one last ritual that speaks to their unique understanding of impermanence. They dismantled their rope bridges, not from defeat, but from completion. Each rope was carefully unraveled, each fiber burned in ceremonies that lasted for months. The smoke from these fires, they believed, would carry their accumulated knowledge into the stars themselves, where it would wait to be rediscovered by future civilizations advanced enough to read the language of light. In the delta regions, where great rivers once flowed into seas that have since changed their borders, there lived a people known only through the songs that still echo in the languages of their successors. The Nolamba were water weavers, architects of aquatic cities that rose and fell with tidal rhythms, structures that existed in harmony with flood cycles rather than in opposition to them. Their civilization was built upon an understanding of hydrology so sophisticated that it bordered on the mystical. They could predict seasonal floods decades in advance, not through written calculations, but through an oral tradition that encoded meteorological data in epic poems passed down through generations of river singers. These were bards whose voices could supposedly summon rain or calm tempests, though modern analysis suggests their true power lay in their encyclopedic knowledge of weather patterns. The Nilamba constructed their cities from a material they called singing stone, a composite of river clay, crushed shells, and plant fibers that hardened into a substance both waterproof and acoustically perfect. Their buildings were designed as massive musical instruments, with chambers and passages that transformed the sound of flowing water into haunting melodies. When rivers rose, the cities would sing. When waters receded, the songs would fade to whispers. Archaeological evidence suggests they developed a form of aquaculture that was millennia ahead of its time. Their rice paddies were integrated with fish farms, duck ponds, and lotus gardens in a complex ecosystem that produced food, medicine, and building materials with remarkable efficiency. They understood the nitrogen cycle, crop rotation, and sustainable harvesting practices that modern permaculture experts are only beginning to rediscover. The Nalamba's relationship with water extended beyond the practical into the philosophical. They believed that every body of water possessed its own consciousness, its own song that could be learned and harmonized with. Their priests were as much hydrologists as spiritual leaders, able to taste water and determine its source, its journey, and its destiny. They claimed to hear the memories carried in rain that had fallen on distant mountains, the stories whispered by springs that had flowed since the world was young. Their downfall came not from war or plague, but from a changing climate that their songs could not prevent. As monsoon patterns shifted and rivers changed their courses, the delicate balance of their civilization began to collapse. Rather than abandon their water cities, the Nilamba chose to become one with the element they had served for so long. Historical accounts from neighboring peoples describe a night when all the river singers sang in unison, their voices carrying across hundreds of miles of waterways. By morning, their cities were empty, though the songs continued to echo from the water itself for years afterward. Modern listeners claim that on certain still nights, when river mists rise and moonlight dances on dark waters, the songs of the Nilamba can still be heard. Scientists dismiss these accounts as acoustic phenomena created by wind passing through abandoned structures, but local fishermen know better. They speak of catching dreams in their nets, of waters that sing lullabies to soothe crying children, of rivers that remember when they had names in a language the world has forgotten, where the Sahara meets the sky in horizons that stretch beyond. Earthly comprehension, there once lived a people who transformed the act of survival into the highest form of art. The Tamashek, not to be confused with the modern Tuareg, who bear a similar name, were dancers of dust and wind. Nomads who had learned to read the desert's moods like poets read verse. They left no permanent settlements, no monuments to mark their passage, yet their influence can be traced across North Africa in the trade routes they established, the wells they dug, and the star navigation techniques they developed. The Tamashek were ghost architects, builders of invisible cities that existed only in the shared memory of their people. They could create temporary shelters that perfectly harmonized with wind patterns, structures that channeled cooling breezes, and provided shade without interrupting the desert's natural flow. Their understanding of the desert's hidden life surpassed that of any people before or since. They knew of underground rivers that flowed beneath seemingly barren dunes, of oases that appeared only during certain seasons, of plants that bloomed once per decade in response to rare rainfall patterns. This knowledge was encoded in their dances, complex choreographed movements that served as both artistic expression and navigational instruction. The dust dances of the Tamashek were performances that could last for days, with dancers moving in patterns that mimicked the flow of wind across sand. Each gesture had meaning. The position of a hand indicated the direction of the nearest water source. The arc of a foot traced the path of seasonal migrations. The rhythm of shoulder movements encoded the timing of sandstorms weeks in advance. To watch a Tamashek dust dance was to receive a masterclass in desert survival disguised as entertainment. They developed a form of medicine based on the healing properties of different types of sand and dust. Their healers could diagnose illness by observing how sand clung to a patient's skin, prescribing treatments that involved burial in specific dunes, known for their therapeutic minerals. They understood that the desert was not empty but alive, filled with microscopic life forms that could cure or kill, depending on how they were approached. The Tamashek were master metallurgists, capable of forging weapons and tools from iron extracted from meteorites found in the deep desert. They believed that metal from the stars carried the wisdom of the cosmos, and their smiths were as much astronomers as craftsmen. Their blades were said to sing when drawn, producing musical tones that indicated their quality and the skill of their makers. Their oral tradition spoke of a great convergence that would occur once every 1,000 years, when all the scattered tribes of the Tamashek would gather at a sacred site deep in the desert's heart. The last such gathering is said to have taken place during a total solar eclipse that darkened the Sahara for 7 minutes, an astronomical event that modern calculations confirm occurred in the 4th century CE. According to the few surviving accounts, thousands of Tamashek converged on a location that has never been found, despite numerous expeditions. There, beneath the darkened sun, they performed the final dust dance, a ceremony so powerful that it was said to have summoned a sandstorm that lasted for 7 days and 7 nights. When the storm cleared, the Tamashek had vanished, leaving behind only their footprints pressed into glass sand that had been transformed by some known process into crystalline formations that still glitter beneath the dunes. Desert travelers occasionally report finding these glass footprints, perfect impressions of human feet frozen in clear crystal. Some claim they pulse with their own light during certain phases of the moon, as if the Tamashek continue to dance just beneath the surface of the visible world, their movements creating brief glimpses of the eternal choreography that keeps the desert alive in the volcanic islands of the Pacific, where fire meets water in eternal conversation. There existed a civilization that learned to speak the language of stone itself. The Monahiti were lithomancers, interpreters of rock and mineral who could read the earth's memory in crystalline formations and hear prophecies in the song of cooling lava. They built their cities into the living rock of volcanic slopes, not carving or cutting, but somehow convincing the stone to flow like water, shaping itself into dwellings and temples that appeared to have grown rather than been constructed. Their architecture defied every known principle of engineering, with buildings that seemed to float within solid rock, chambers that existed in spaces that should have been occupied by mountain core. The Monahiti understood volcanic activity with a precision that saved them from eruptions that destroyed neighboring civilizations. They could taste ash on the wind weeks before an eruption, feel the mountain's heartbeat through their bare feet, interpret the colors of sunset to predict which peaks would awaken and which would sleep. Their priests maintained a constant dialogue with the volcanic spirits, offering songs and ceremonial dances that seemed to influence the timing and intensity of eruptions. Their greatest achievement was the creation of living sculptures, artworks carved from volcanic glass that continued to change and evolve over time. These pieces were somehow designed to respond to natural forces, altering their forms in response to temperature changes, seismic activity, and tidal variations. Some of these sculptures were said to be prophetic, their changing shapes revealing glimpses of future events to those trained to interpret their transformations. The Monahiti developed a form of stone singing that could allegedly influence the behavior of molten rock. Their singers could stand at the edge of lava flows and, through complex vocal harmonies, guide the direction of liquid stone away from populated areas. Modern geologists dismiss these accounts as myth, yet geological evidence suggests that several major lava flows in the region did indeed change direction at impossible angles, following paths that defy natural law. Their civilization reached its peak during a period of intense volcanic activity that would have been catastrophic for any other people. The Monahiti thrived in conditions that should have been uninhabitable, their stone speakers working in constant collaboration with the volcanic forces to create new land, new harbors, and new mineral deposits. They were literally partners in the creation of their world, helping to shape islands that rose from the ocean floor through their understanding of geological processes. The end of the Monahiti came not from volcanic destruction, but from volcanic silence. When the island's volcanoes entered an unexpected period of dormancy, the stone speakers found themselves unable to maintain their dialogue with the earth's depths. Without the constant conversation with molten rock, their living sculptures began to crack and crumble. Their stone-woven buildings lost their flexibility and started to collapse. Faced with the silence of their stone partners, the Monahiti made a decision that echoes through Pacific mythology to this day. Rather than abandon their calling, they chose to join the stones in their silence. The last stone speakers gathered in their deepest temple, a chamber carved into the heart of the dormant volcano. There they began their final song, a harmonic composition so complex and beautiful that it was said to awaken the sleeping mountain one last time. Witnesses from neighboring islands reported seeing the mountain glow from within, not with the red light of lava, but with a soft, musical luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with the singers' voices. The glow lasted for 3 days and 3 nights before finally fading. When explorers eventually reached the temple, they found it sealed by smooth, flowing stone that showed no tool marks or seams, as if the mountain itself had gently closed its doors on the last ceremony of the stone speakers. Local traditions maintain that on certain nights when the moon is dark and the ocean is calm, the mountain still glows faintly from within. Scientists attribute this to phosphorescent minerals activated by seismic micromovements. But islanders know it is the continuing song of the Monahiti, their voices now woven permanently into the stone they loved so deeply, that as night settles over the vast expanse of human history, as the last echoes of ancient voices fade into the whisper of wind through ruins, we find ourselves standing at the threshold between remembering and forgetting. The unknown peoples of the ancient world did not vanish without trace. They became the trace itself, woven into the very fabric of human consciousness, like threads in a tapestry whose pattern we are only beginning to perceive. In laboratories across the world, geneticists decode DNA extracted from ancient bones and find fragments of peoples who left no other record of their existence. Linguists discover loanwords in modern languages that originated in tongues spoken before the first cities rose. Archaeologists unearth artifacts that speak of technologies and philosophies that seem to have emerged from nowhere, fully formed, carrying within them the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that history has forgotten to remember. The Atlas, with their impossible mathematics, continue to calculate in the movement of tectonic plates, their equations written in the slow dance of countenance. The Nephilim's architectural dreams echo in the sacred geometry of cathedrals and temples, their understanding of space and proportion channeled through builders who never knew their names. The Hyperboreans' weather-weaving persists in the migration patterns of birds, in the timing of storms, in the subtle influence they exerted on atmospheric systems that still carry their signature across polar skies. The Umbral ones taught darkness to be a canvas for light, and their lessons illuminate every night sky viewed by wandering eyes. The Zanskar's stellar calculations tick away in the cosmic clock, their astronomical observations encoded in stone circles and megalithic sites scattered across the world. The Nolambur's water songs murmur in every river's flow, their hydraulic wisdom channeled into the rice terraces and irrigation systems that still feed millions. The Tamashek dance on in the patterns of wind-carved dunes, their choreography written in the movement of sand across continents. The Monahiti's stone songs resonate in the deep structures of volcanic islands, Their understanding of geological forces embedded in the very foundations of the lands they helped to shape. Each of these peoples contributed threads to the vast weaving of human knowledge, their individual voices joining in a chorus that continues to sing across the centuries. Perhaps this is what the ancients understood, that we are only beginning to rediscover. That memory is not merely the recording of what has been, but the active preservation of what must continue to be. The unknown peoples did not seek to build monuments that would outlast time, they sought to become time itself. To weave their discoveries and insights so deeply into the human experience that they would survive every catastrophe, every dark age, every forgetting. They understood that true immortality lies not in the persistence of stone or metal, but in the transmission of wisdom from mind to mind, from generation to generation, from one dreaming consciousness to another. They made themselves into living ideas, and ideas, unlike empires, do not crumble. They evolve, they adapt, they find new forms of expression in each age that rediscovers them. The archaeological record is full of impossible artifacts, devices that should not have existed, knowledge that should not have been available, techniques that should not have been developed for centuries or millennia after their apparent first use. These anomalies are not mistakes in dating or interpretation. They are messages from the unknown peoples, evidence of their continued presence in the unfolding story of human civilization. Every time a child looks at the stars and wonders about other worlds, the Nephilim stir in their cosmic sleep. Every time an engineer designs a structure that seems to defy gravity, the Atlassians whisper through the mathematics. Every time a poet finds words to describe the indescribable, the ghost language of vanished peoples flows through their pen. Every time a dreamer seeks to understand the mystery of their own existence, they join the eternal conversation that began before history and will continue long after its end. The unknown peoples remain unknown, not because their traces cannot be found, but because they chose to hide in plain sight. They encoded themselves into the most basic human activities, the planting of seeds, the building of shelters, the telling of stories, the gazing at stars. They made themselves indispensable to the continuation of human consciousness, ensuring their survival not through conquest or conversion, but through the simple act of making themselves useful to the future. In this way, they achieved something that no emperor or pharaoh ever could. They became eternal not through monuments, but through necessity, not through fame, but through function. They are the unnamed inventors of agriculture, the anonymous architects of the first cities, the forgotten philosophers whose ideas became so fundamental to human thinking that we no longer remember when we first learnt them. As you close your eyes and feel the gentle pull of sleep, know that you are surrounded by the presence of these ancient minds. In the rhythm of your breath, the umbral ones maintain their eternal meditation. In the beating of your heart, the Monahiti continue their drone songs. In the movement of your blood, the Nalamba's water wisdom flows on. In the firing of your neurons, the Atlassians' impossible mathematics continue their eternal calculations. You are the descendant not only of those whose names fill history books, but of the unknown multitudes who chose to remain nameless so that their contributions might outlast their identities. Every human ability, every fundamental insight, every basic understanding of how to live in harmony with the natural world, all of these gifts were preserved and transmitted by peoples whose names we may never know, but whose presence we carry within our very cells. The great mystery is not who these peoples were, but who they are. For they are not gone, they have simply changed form, As water changes from ice to liquid to vapor, yet remains forever water. They live on in every act of human creativity, in every moment of scientific discovery, in every expression of artistic beauty, in every gesture of compassion toward others. They are the keepers of tomorrow's memory, the guardians of possibilities, not yet born, the eternal witnesses to the unfolding story of consciousness itself. And as you drift into the realm of dreams, you join their timeless vigil, becoming yourself a keeper of the flame they have passed from hand to hand across the millennia, in sleep, in dreams, in the soft spaces between waking thoughts. The unknown peoples continue their work. They tend the gardens of imagination. They maintain the libraries of genetic memory. They weave the stories that will become tomorrow's myths. They are working still, these patient ancestors, these anonymous benefactors, these unknown friends, who loved the future more than they loved their own fame. Sleep now, knowing that you are held in the embrace of countless generations of human wisdom. Rest in the certainty that every breath you take carries the accumulated knowledge of civilizations beyond counting. Dream the dreams that connect you to the eternal conversation between past and future, between the known and the unknown, between memory and possibility. For in the end, we are all unknown peoples, each carrying within ourselves the seeds of discoveries that will not flower until long after our own names have been forgotten. We are all keepers of mysteries we do not yet understand, guardians of potentials we may never see realized, contributors to a story whose ending remains forever unwritten. The unknown peoples of the ancient world are not behind us in time, they are around us in eternity, within us in essence, before us in possibility. They are the eternally present gift of human consciousness to itself, the proof that love and wisdom, once brought into being, never truly die but only transform, finding new expressions in each generation that receives and passes on the sacred flame of awareness. Rest now in this knowledge. Sleep now in this embrace. Dream now these eternal dreams. You are never alone, for you carry within yourself the presence of every human being who ever lived, loved, wondered, and chose to give their discoveries to the future rather than take their secrets to the grave. The unknown peoples sleep when you sleep, wake when you wake, dream when you dream. In the morning light, their work continues through your hands. Their songs continue through your voice. Their questions continue through your wondering mind. You are their descendant, their continuation, their hope made manifest in flesh and blood and consciousness. Welcome to the eternal company of the unknown. Welcome to the timeless communion of the forgotten. Welcome to the endless story of human becoming, where every ending is a beginning. Every silence a song waiting to be sung. Every mystery an invitation to deeper understanding. Close your eyes now and join the dance that began before time and will continue beyond it. Sleep in the knowledge that you are held, remembered, loved by those who came before and will be remembered, held, loved by those who come after. You are a link in the golden chain of consciousness that connects all human experience across all time. The unknown peoples whisper their final blessing. May you dream with the wisdom of ages. May you wake with the wonder of children. May you live with the knowledge that every moment of your existence adds to the great treasure of human experience that we hold in trust for tomorrow's unknowing gifts to the world. Sleep now, dream now, become now another unknown keeper of tomorrow's memory. If this story stayed with you as you drifted off, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. We release weekly journeys into the forgotten and Every dreaming soul is welcome here.